Okay, great. Welcome everyone. My name is Elise Shrock, and I am a trainer with the National Democratic Training Committee, but I am also an Indiana Young Democrat, very proudly, and I'm here to talk to everyone a little bit about how you can use your personal story to connect with voters. It's something I personally believe in so much, and I'm so passionate about teaching this lesson. This is usually the time when I'm speaking to my students from across the nation, where I apologize for Mike Pence to all the people who are not from here. But the best part of that little spiel that I give them is I say, well, sorry for Mike Pence, but you're probably going to be glad to know that especially the Young Democrats in Indiana are busting their butts to undo the work that the harmful work that he has been at for a while. And I always let them know that we even flipped the council from Republican to Democrat in his hometown of Columbus with some amazing, incredible young Democrats. So I figured I should spare you that speech, but I also wanted to let you know that I'm bragging about you all the time to folks across the nation when I do this. So a little bit about me. Here in Indianapolis, I work for a small boutique lobbying firm. I'm the director of operations and the principal Democrat there. So while I'm not hunkering down or staying home, I'm at the State House a lot. And the State House and legislative campaigns are really where I came up in this work. My very first campaign that I worked on that was outside of my family was actually in 2004. The Kernan Davis campaign. I helped out at a field office in Howard County. And then from 2008 to 2016, I worked for the Indiana Senate Democrats. And most recently, I served as their deputy chief of staff and their communications director. And then now, obviously, I'm at the firm, TAM Capital Group. So I'm in the halls of the State House. We're doing local lobbying, and then we do a little federal as well. In addition to my day job, I love being involved with Indiana Young Democrats. I serve as a founding board member for Hoosier Women Forward, a lot of fabulous young Dems, including Kaisa Goodman, the new 9th District IYD rep, is a Hoosier Women Forward alum. I also have the privilege of serving as the president of the Indiana Latino Democratic Caucus, which is something that I'm very passionate about and really proud of all the work we're doing there. So that's a little bit about me and where I'm coming from with this presentation. So let's get on to it. Here, I just want to kind of lay the groundwork and give some context to the era we're in. As we go through this deck, please believe me when I say I know where you're at. So much of what I've done with our working around state party, the legislature, out and about the state, has really been, even prior to COVID, while I'm happy I do a lot of digital communications, a lot of that digital communications was dependent on content from events or content from things that were out and about to tell that story. So even as a storyteller, this is who's comfortable in the digital space. This time it has really challenged me as well. So we'll have that context going throughout the whole training. So let's get ready to train. I know you've all been in front of your computers watching this fabulous convention that's going on. So just to kind of intentionally realign ourselves and get ready for this training and ground ourselves, just take a deep breath in and out. Roll your shoulders back a little bit, move your neck. Your eyes, always want to show gratitude for our eyes as we're able, since we're having a lot of screen time. So give them a little bit of a look around, squeeze them, open them. Perfect. I also want to set some norms for what we're going to do today. First off, we want to remain respectful in the chat. When we're sharing our stories, we're being vulnerable, so please be respectful of what those who share in the chat with us do share. Second, be present. We have a lot to cover in not much time, and I've turned off all of my notifications and ask that you kindly do the same. And then finally, please ask questions. I will do my best to keep an eye on the chat and make sure that I am identifying all your questions, but please feel free to engage, and there are going to be plenty of times where I ask for input on the chat, so be sure to engage. Also, we're going to be recording, we've recorded a number of these trainings from the National Democrat Training Committee. So if you get nervous about taking notes, just try to be present. And then we actually have a link, traindems.org. You can find a whole lot of information there. It's free, you just have to sign up, and then you'll be able to access this information. And thank you, Keith, who is running the show behind the scenes. Nothing like having an actual professional run your tech production. And he'll be dropping links in the chat as we go. So our objectives today are, as we adapt in light of the pandemic, we're going to understand why your stories matter in your campaigns or your democratic work during COVID-19. And then we're going to practice our story of self. So in the chat, just as an icebreaker, just to kind of get a gauge for what folks are here, can you please let me know what your your local issue is that matters to you most? And I'll give folks a couple seconds to throw something into the chat. What is one local issue that really sets you on fire? Public education, funding, and support. Yes, education. This is just one we get all across the nation. Voter disenfranchisement. We got a lot of that here. Public education funding. Again, these are all great answers. Thank you for sharing, Heather, Amanda, Dylan. Really appreciate that. So these are the types of things that really set us on fire. These are, my dog is letting himself into the room right now, so pardon me for any distraction and any sounds in the background. Oh, infrastructure, specifically internet access. That is a really good one, and especially relevant now. But we're going to talk a little bit about why these local issues that really light us on fire from the inside burn in our passions, and why they are a critical part of our story and why it matters. And before we get into our own personal stories, and I'm also going to provide you a lot of resources. I know we're moving quickly in our allotted time, but don't worry, I'll have homework for you. We want to break this down into multiple different pieces to kind of provide an infrastructure for how you tell your story and how it's impactful. So we're going to talk about this public narrative triangle. This framework is based on the work of Marshall Gans at Harvard University. Very grateful for his leadership in this space. But public narrative is an exercise of leadership by motivating others to join you in action on behalf of a shared purpose. So, I mean, I don't know what could possibly encapsulate exactly what we're trying to do by persuading voters and bringing people into our work better than this. So public narrative really brings three stories: the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now into conversation with each other, so people can move to action. So that's why this story of self has become a staple of political campaigns, and it's got to be kind of an equal part. So the story of self, which is my story, the story of us, how I take that story and make it about our community. And then the story of now is where we take the next element, which is action, how we move people to act in reaction to our story and feel like they're a part of it. So let's break down these three parts and really dig into how emotion and connection are big parts of how you communicate with voters. So for myself, I'll go into my story a little bit, but I want to just kind of go over what the story of self is. It is a personal story and an emphasis on that. We'll go back to that personal story that clearly and concisely encapsulates your story and why you're taking action. And when you're thinking about this, I want you to be really reflective about what you can authentically speak to and what really is meaningful to you. A lot of folks, when we go into these exercises, they're like, well, in my community, the people in my community are concerned about whatever hot button item. This is separate from that. We're going to be talking about our own authentic experiences. And that's really important because in a campaign, that's what voters want to see, authenticity. They want to see you for who you really are. They want to share your passion for what you're doing. And that's what's going to motivate them to kind of move through that escalated ladder of engagement. So just keep that in mind. This is about you. And for me, one of the issues that really is important to me is representation. I come from a family of immigrants who, as soon as they got to America, were very quick to get involved in the political process. My uncle was the first Hispanic mayor in Indiana. So I was really lucky to have a lot of exposure to the political process, and I was very lucky to see my own Hispanic family getting to have a seat at the table. And it wasn't until I left home and graduated high school and went out into the real world that I really saw how lucky I was, and unfortunately how abnormal that was for our state. So a couple years went by. I started working for the Indiana Senate Democratic Caucus. While I was there, former, and I'm very glad to say former, Senator Mike Delph, who is replaced by our own, the great, the one and only State Senator J.D. Ford. But back then, Senator Delph had authored and passed a lot of laws that were incredibly damaging to our community. And unfortunately, when I tried to, yes, shout out to Senator J.D. Ford, but when we tried to figure out how we could undo some of these laws, I was looking around on staff and at the folks who I worked for, and there was no Latino or Hispanic representation. So I was lucky that they let me create a space for that. So I, with other staff members, created the Indiana Senate Democratic Latino Roundtable, where we created a table, not even just brought them to the table, we created a table for Latinos from across the state to come and tell us what issues needed to be addressed and how we needed to fix that. So that kind of led me to where I'm at today, where, you know, last summer I got tapped on the shoulder and asked to be part of the Indiana Latino Democratic Caucus, and I said yes, because we are nowhere where we need to be when it comes to representation, and if I can continue this work to help that, that is something I'm passionate about, and that's something that benefits our state. So I'm pleased to say that we have Latino candidates, Latinx candidates running at every single level of government, local, state, and federal, for the 2020 election. We're excited about that, but we're going to need all the help we can get. So I'm asking you to help, to listen, to reach out to these candidates, to make space for them in your organizations, and to support them, because we will all be better off because of their efforts, because our issues are not that dissimilar from any other Hoosier. It's just we lack the access. So please help us. So that was my personal story. And I went into that as an example of how to tell your story. And then we're gonna, in the next couple of slides, break it down. So as you just saw, the story of self, or as you, I hope you think from my example, the story of self is a powerful organizing tool. It allows us to connect with voters and volunteers in our campaigns. It allows us to build authentic relationships with people in our communities. And it moves others to action by joining our campaign teams or our organizations. And it really can be very intersectional, which is what I personally love. It's your story, not a full campaign message or platform. This story is the guiding light for how you message and what future platforms and policies connect back to. So hopefully that makes sense. So this is your personal story, and it will inform your platform, your policies, and it will be an authentic space that you can lead into those from. Further breaking down the infrastructure of what I just did there, the formula of story of self is a conversation so that you can effectively connect with your voters. So each story needs a challenge, a choice, an outcome, and an ask. So the challenge was representation. Aside from my very lucky early experience as a kid seeing my uncle in Indiana, we don't got it. The choice was do something about it. Create a space for Latinos, Latinx, Hispanic Hoosiers to bring their issues to the table. Join and become a leader in the Indiana Latino Democratic Caucus. That was the choice. The outcome? We have candidates running across the state, every corner of the state, every level of government. We have folks who we can support. And my ask was for us to continue that work, we need you to listen to them, to create space for them, and to ensure that you're helping them along by giving them your support. So, and if I was from a little bit of a digital comm side, if I was doing that presentation outside of this training, I would be throwing a ton of links in the chat about who was running, where you could donate to them, and the ask would be even harder, a much harder ask. So that is a little bit about the infrastructure. Are there any questions? I just want to pause here. Does anyone have any questions right now? Feel free to put them in the chat if you do. I'll give you just like a couple seconds in case there's any stories or any questions. Okay, cool. Well, if you have any questions at any time, feel free to pop them in the chat. So next, now that you've heard my story of self and we've reviewed each part of my story, I want to just take just a couple, let's take until 2 o'clock, so 6 minutes. I want everyone on this call to write a quick draft of their story of self. And I'm going to move to the next slide so that you can have the question prompts in front of you. So you'll be, let's see. Ooh, that's a good question, Dylan. Okay, before we start, I will say using your story of self to persuade people who initially disagree with you really helps disarm your sparring opponent, for lack of better terms, because this is your experience, these are your feelings, this is your authentic experience and perspective that you're speaking from, and no one can take that away from you. So if you are speaking from that space, it initially disarms, it helps create context and kind of disarms the person you're disagreeing with. They're not able to say, well, you don't feel that way, because clearly you do. You know who you are. This is your story. It's no one else's. So that's why the story of self is so important. It really, it brings a lot of validity to the issue that you're speaking to. And at the end of the day, if they agree or disagree, they're going to respect you for your being vulnerable and telling your own story, or they should. People generally value and respect authenticity, even if they disagree with a person's stance on the issue. And that will help you. Maybe you don't find agreement in that moment, but that's going to help you build a continuing dialogue with that person, to maybe one day you can move them through the ladder of engagement and get them to vote for you, or get them to pull into that hard ask that you're asking of them. So Dylan, great question. Okay, so let's go until 2:01. If everyone can just take a moment and just draft your story of self using these prompts. Write about a challenge you faced and really dig into the challenge. What did you choose to do? What happened? And what do you need help with to keep your issue moving forward or to accomplish a goal? All right, we're going to give you one more minute to wrap up your example, and then we'll continue. Okay, everyone, 2:01 time is up. So let's reflect a little bit together on how that went. Hopefully you were able to really show your challenge and not just speak to an issue. Um, if you can you type into the chat what your challenge was? Anyone willing to share? Give folks a couple seconds to write one in. Public ed folks. Yep, activating educators to rally at the State House. Ooh, that's a good one. That's a really good one. Any others? So the challenge, I really want to dig into the challenge because it really enriches the story. This is where you are really going to be able to, instead of making people, you really want to make people feel something about your problem. And the challenge is really where people develop those feelings like, oh man, things are, challenges. We have to get these folks to the State House. We have to have our voice heard. If the legislature isn't going to see thousands of teachers out there, we won't be heard. So really dig into the challenge. Activating educators to rally at the State House, that is great. And I think that's definitely going to lead to a very good ask, but I think it's great to broaden it out. What would activating educators to rally at the State House mean for education funding or teacher pay or better testing or getting rid of vouchers? So I would try and broaden that out a little bit and talk about all the different reasons why you would need those folks to be at the State House. Does anyone else have an example they'd like to share? Let me go back up and look at a couple other issues. Voter disenfranchisement, Heather mentioned that. If that is your challenge, if your challenge is that you've been disenfranchised or you can't, or your neighbor wasn't able to vote, that is one where that's the challenge. Your choice to do something about it could be to lobby the State House for a law change, to reach out to the election division and get an order changed, an administrative order change, or get 10 people to sign a petition to send it to Connie Lawson. But those challenges, can't underscore enough, those challenges and how you talk about them really tee up your personal story. And it's also really important for us to know how to tailor our story. So you have your personal story, and someone asked this earlier, Dylan asked this earlier, how do you use it to persuade people who may disagree with you? On the other side of that, you can also use this as a way to speak to different issues that come up in a venue that you're speaking in. So for instance, maybe you're up in Northwest Indiana and you're speaking and there's a Q&A and someone asks, well, I've heard your issues, your personal story is really effective, but what are you gonna do? How does that help me with the lead that's in our water? Well, representation is part of that. I think it would better serve our whole state if there were statewide electeds who were from Northwest Indiana and who cared about that issue, who placed our environment first and had a seat at the table and a vote to make sure that they were enacting policy that it could ensure that we were addressing the lead issues in that region head on. So you can kind of see where I came from that. Representation was the catalyst for my story, and I was able to pivot that in a way to adapt it and tailor it to another issue. And that's why I say this personal story really informs where you're going to go with your other policies. For instance, if they said education, if education was part of your personal story and the challenge was education funding, and that same person came to you and said, what am I going to do about the lead in our water in Northwest Indiana? Well, I think to solve these problems, we have to have the best and the brightest leaders at the table. And that starts from a foundation of education. And our teachers have to have the resources they need to teach those leaders, those future leaders, to hopefully fix those issues one day, and to have a very strong infrastructure of education so that they can become leaders and that they know the issues in their communities and that they feel a part of their community to get involved. So those are a couple of examples how you can take your personal story and pivot and tailor it to speak to what someone else's passion is. And I think that's your own stories are so powerful in that way. They're yours, they're unique, they're important. And when you're able to connect with folks by tailoring it in a way that speaks to where they're coming from, I think that's a really persuasive and powerful way to bring people in and to make that ask. So, any other thoughts in the chat? I don't know how many of you are having to pivot to speak to voter issues that are related to COVID-19. If there are, feel free to share that in the chat. But I think in this era, when we're telling our personal stories, pretty much everything leads back to how COVID-19 has really pulled the curtain back on all the disparities in our state, whether we're talking from a representation angle, like where I like to come from, the fact that Black and Brown communities are disproportionately affected much more by this virus, shows what happens when there's not someone at the State House who is representing them or keeping their needs at their forefront. Education funding, I think we're all, anyone with kids is learning how important teachers are and the work that they put in and day out, and why they deserve the pay that they're not getting, and that we should be paying them more. So we're in an era that's a challenge, but it's also underscored a lot of issues that I think we're going to be able to tailor our personal stories to. So I encourage you to do that. Meet the moment head on and talk about these issues. Folks are looking for leadership. They're looking for strong leadership. They're looking for someone to, we may not have all the answers, but we can empower folks with a plan forward, and to let them know that they're not alone and that there are tools that we can offer them, especially the vote, to choose leaders who will help get us through this incredibly challenging time. So feel free, don't ignore the time that we're in when you are telling your story. So we're bumping up to 2:10. We're about ready to kind of wrap up. I do want to tell you though, back on that last slide, we do have a number of resources. We do have a number of resources that traindemocrats.org has available to you. And I want to point you to those because while we did kind of a mini session today, traindems.org has a whole suite, whether you're looking at fundraising, digital training, communications field. They have those tools where you can take what we've learned today and apply it to all of those different areas. There is a Google folder that has worksheets that you can, we'll talk about two of them that I think are particularly important to take away from. this training. And then you can also set up an account, and they have speakers, a lot of great resources. So I just don't want you to not find access to those, because that'll help bolster the training we've done today. I will move on to takeaways, but I was going to see if anyone wanted to practice their story of self before we left. So if there's someone in the attendees list, if you want to raise your hand, if you're willing to, we can do a practice run on whatever your story of self is. And really, this is a very safe space. So it sometimes helps to walk through that. Anyone? Any volunteers? Raise your hand. Amanda Qualls. Are you, Amanda, are you volunteering? Or are you volunteering someone else? And I think, as an example, Keith, if you want to kind of tell me what you've written out. I know, oh, okay. Oh, people are volunteering you. If you're up for it, raise your hand and we'll unmute you. But if not, we can do an example run through with Keith. I just think it's really, really helpful to hear someone else talk through it. All right, Keith, you are up.
All right, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Hi.
Hi.
So tell me a little bit about your story and what you came up with through those prompts.
Yeah, so through these prompts, and this is something because I actually went through this a similar training through the NDTC before I was a candidate and then became an elected official. So I've gone through some of this training before. And one thing I love about the personal story exercise is once you get it, you can literally relate everything to it.
Beauty of it.
And once you really, it's finding that thing that no matter what type of day you've had, no matter whether it's been a great morning, terrible morning, if you get thinking about this, it truly gets you impassioned about it. And sorry for sort of jumping, but I know.
No, that's exactly what that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to be something that because it's so important to you, it's something that you can speak about in any scenario.
And the connector that I use most often is I grew up across the street from my grandparents. I was very, very close to them. My mom was their primary caretaker as they got older. One of my favorite things that I would do whenever I was home from college is I would go and pick up my grandfather and I'd take him to his barber shop to get his hair cut because he couldn't drive anymore. But what my grandparents have both since passed, but just what was instilled in me through them was this need to help the people who need the help. And our senior citizens are a group of folks who they need a lot of help. And it's not for a lack of trying, it's not for a lack of resources, it's we need to make efforts to help the people who need it the most. And we see that in so many facets. So I know for me, finding a way to connect it personally to my relationship with my grandparents and helping me to connect that to because the most urgent issues of our time are the ones that address the most vulnerable among us. So I know that was kind of haphazard, but hopefully that was helpful.
No, I mean, there's a challenge in there. Your grandparents are seeking access to what they need as a at-risk or vulnerable community. Your choice was to do something about it, and I think you have got yourself elected as counselor, so you are doing things for those. for those communities, and the outcome is you won. But the ask, I would say, because you always want to end with an ask when you're telling your story, is support my work by signing up for my council newsletter, stay in the loop with me, or if it's a campaign year, I need resources to be reelected to keep doing this work. Here's a link to where you can donate. This is my app, Blue. So yes to all that, just add the ask. And I think this particular training is sometimes difficult because I see folks so much wanting to do this work because they're thinking about others. This is a time where you get to be very selfish. And sometimes it's scary when you're thinking about your own story, because you have to face yourself very openly and honestly about what makes you feel like this work is so important. So, I have a lot of folks when we do this training, they're like, well, there's a 4-way stop in my town, and that's really important to everyone. I'm like, and that's okay if that's the one thing that got you really going in this work, but is that the one moment in your whole life where you felt the spark to think, I can do something differently to help my community? And that's what you have to always go back to, because that spark, every time you speak to it in your campaign, will get reignited over and over and over again. And that just fuels your work. So it's good to be selfish. And the ask is hard too. It's hard to make an ask. Call time sucks. It does.
And I will say, this work, it's so often, I know this from going through and continuing to try and refine it, is, like you said, the work is selfish, and like you said at the beginning, it's uncomfortable. It's weird to kind of, you're trying to write the thesis of a documentary on your life when you're just trying to get started in public service. And that's a really difficult challenge to meet. But it could not be more valuable in being able to put in the 4-way stop sign, in being able to get to connect with the voters and get the votes necessary to be able to institute that change. It's so valuable being able to communicate that story to people. And it takes time. You have to take time to sit and think about it, record yourself on a voice memo, and then listen back to it.
Ask your friends to listen, because often they know you well and you will forget details that they are very proud of you for. Ask your friends, talk to your crew. And again, that ask is part of how you get the work done. So if you feel too selfish making the ask, think of it as a large formula for how you're going to accomplish and fix the challenge you started out with. And at the end of the day, if you stepped up, you're on the ballot, you're on a leadership team, you are donating and working and putting your time in to make change and create inclusive, equitable spaces for people in our state, you deserve to be able to make that ask. You are very worthy of that ask. People who do this work, you get to ask for things. You get to. So be proud of the work that you do. And but if that ask is uncomfortable, and as it is for me often, even as bossy as I love to be, the ask is part of getting the goal accomplished, and that's what you're going for. It's part of the work, the greater good, the work towards the greater good. So with that, Keith, I would love, if you have anything else to add, please let me know.
Sure. I think because where most people enter public service is at a super local level. It's at a level where you can potentially knock on the door of every single voter that you would like to vote for you. And that, without a voter realizing it, it's in sharing your personal story and in being your as authentic as self as you can be, that also it allows to sort of bring down the barriers that people feel with public servants and with candidates and elected officials. We're oftentimes just faces or names that appear on mail and on TV ads, and only when there's an election year. So the personal story aspect of it really drives getting the work done. And the personal story aspect of it does require you to brag on yourself a little bit. Like Elise mentioned, your personal story, because what it demonstrates when you kind of brag about something you did, it demonstrates your values. It's not just saying, look, this is the really nice thing I did, congratulate me for it. Exactly, tossing the hair around. It's about so much more than that. You're telling the story because the values at the center of it, the focus at the center of it, are really exemplary of the type of work that you want to do moving forward. I'll give, Elise, if you don't mind, I'll give a short version of a story that I told at an MCYD meeting I know we were at together, that sort of ties into this, if it's all right. There was one day I was driving downtown, and this is one of those stories that's kind of uncomfortable to tell. I'll give you the internal monologue while I tell this personal story. How about that? So you understand where I'm at and why it is uncomfortable to tell sometimes. Because I did something, this was a thing that I did that was very nice. I didn't have to do, but I did it because it felt like the right thing to do. And it feels weird to share when you're just doing something that was right. But at the same time, we need to introduce ourselves to folks. We need to make sure folks know unequivocally where our values are. So there was one day I was driving downtown. I saw cars swerving. I thought maybe there was a loose box that had fallen off the back of a truck or something. And when I got closer, it turned out that cars were swerving to avoid hitting a woman who was standing in the middle of the road. She was an older Black woman. She was waving her arms, trying to flag somebody down. People just kept swerving, driving around her. And I pulled up, I rolled my window down, and I said, is everything okay? What's wrong? Long story short, is this woman was having a diabetic episode, and it was really severe health episode. And she was experiencing homelessness at the time. A bus just dropped her off at that corner because it was near a church that she knew might be able to help her. But she could barely walk, she could barely stand. And so I had this moment where I just decided, somebody's got to get her to that church. Somebody has to get her to that church. And this woman, she has, a different background than me, but I couldn't help but think about the fact that she might have a grandson who grew up across the street from her, and who I really hope that if my grandmother, when she was around, if she needed help, I really hope that he would help her. That's why I felt compelled to help her. And I got her to her church, I got her inside, and I got her situated. And
that goes right back to the original challenge that you talk about and where you derive your personal story from. And I think that's really impactful, because there are going to be ways that you can tell this story over and over again. And you'll keep collecting stories, and they'll keep being a part of who you are and why you're running. And it will motivate people, and it will be those little ripples on the pond that build out and create a stronger party for us, and get our policies, more importantly, get our policies where they need to be. And that's what this is all about, making change for our communities. So with that, Brandon we need to do a little quick change in our house so I can get him he's going to be producing the next general session. So we're going to wrap up. Does anyone, let's see, are there any last questions? If not,
type in some link information.
Oh yeah, type in some, you could, I want to make sure you get some links to all those resources that we were talking about, how you can practice this, the worksheets. This is my email address. Please feel free to reach out if you'd like to workshop your story a little bit more. If you would like to talk a little bit about what we did today, my handle is @Elise Shrock. Love to see you on Instagram. Love to see you on Twitter. Make sure you're using the hashtags Young Gets It Done and IYD Convention 2020. And then I'm just going to suggest a couple resources on the online academy that Keith is going to put the link in, or put the link into. The Using Personal Stories to Connect worksheet and training, and the Crafting Your Message training are probably the best ones to parlay into from this training to keep doing this work. But of course, always reach out to me when you need me. My information is here. So I'm just going to do a quick thank you to everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of the convention, and get excited for some very excellent programming coming up in the generalist session. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Appreciate you, and have a great day. Thank you.